All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Kislev. Josh and Becca Friedman for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drashos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisroel Yehuda, HaRav Chaim Rephael, as well as for an aliyah for the Neshamas of all of those who were murdered al Kiddush Hashem on Simchas Torah and Yisroel, and for a safe return of all of our hostages and chayalim. Semya Malka Esterson in memory of their parents, Hinda bas Henech Ephraim, Yitzchok Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, and Sarah Rachel bas Baruch Avram. The Pepper family in memory of their brother and uncle Yosef Pepper, Yosef David ben Yaakov Zichron Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors, Doug and Gail Stanger in memory of Doug's father, Shraga Feivel ben Moshe Avram Halevi Zichron Livracha. And of course, as a shir, we dedicate Maseches Bava Kamma in memory of Master Sergeant Eliyahu Michal Harush Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of all of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the Neshamos have an aliyah, and the families a Neshama. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is daf Chof Test 29, and we are picking up on Chof Ches on the base 28b at the two dots. Rabbi Yehuda Ober b'miskavein chayiv. So, Moses, remember again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit, a lot to focus on today. All right, a lot of interesting cases today. So, remember again, we had Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, and what did Rabbi Yehuda say? So, remember the Mishnah's case, which we saw on the bottom of Chof Ches Amud Aleph 28a. So, remember again, the case was Ruvain has a jug. The jug broke in Rishus Harabim. Right, so we have two pieces over here. Water spilled. The Mishnah then says, "V'huchlak achar b'mayim." Someone slipped in the water, or shalakach b'charasis, or was injured by the shards. So two possibilities. What's that? The Mishnah says chayiv. Tanakama says chayiv. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, it depends. B'miskavein chayiv. If there was kavana, then there's liability. If there was no kavana, then there's no liability. So we don't know what kavana means yet. Remember again, yesterday what we spent the bulk of our time focusing on was that halacha l'maisa, what's the nature of the liability of the water? Is water considered bar, right? Or is water considered to be shar, mamo? So that was Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. So now let's move on. Says the Gemara. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer miskavin chayiv. Hehi dali miskavin. Two dots. Right? So again I will say 28b, 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 6, 8 lines up at the bottom. So the Gemara says as follows. I'm sorry? I think I said two dots, no? 14 lines up. So you know what? So let's. Don't be sorry. Chas v'shalom. Okay, fine. Some of Elazar. Lo tema beniskal be'evan v'nashav be'evan u'dem chayiv, which is okay. How did I evolve over that? It's in the middle of the sugya. Okay. All right. We should have started 5:45. I thought I had this. Okay, let's go. Says the Gemara. Amar Elazar. Sorry. Lo shana elash niskal be'evan v'nashav be'evan. So Rabbi Elazar says we were only talking about the case again Machlokes beforehand about Rav and Shmuel, when we were talking about again where he tripped over the stone and ultimately smashed his flask or his jug against the stone. Aval niska b'karka v'nashuf be'evan pater. But if halacha l'maaseh tripped on the ground and then went ahead and smashed his flask against the stony pater, so the Gemara says, Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? To look Rabbi Nassan, not like Rabbi Nassan as we spoke about before. Ikadami, an alternate version of this. Amar Belazar, lo tima b'niska v'nashuf be'evan u'dem chayiv. Don't say that we're talking about a case where he trips over the stone and smashes the jug against the stone that he be chayiv. Aval niskal b'karka v'nashuv be'evan pater. But had he gone ahead and tripped over the ground and smashed the flask or the jug against the stone, he be pater. Ala filo b'niskal b'karka v'nashuv be'evan chayiv. Rather, even in a case ultimately again where he tripped on the ground and he smashed it against the stone, he be chayiv. Rabbi say, whose opinion does that reflect? Ultimately, again, the opinion of Rabbi Nassan. So we'll say, so again, we'll talk about this more before this. We're going to actually loop back to this a little bit, because what this has to do is with the nature of the liability of tripping. When a person trips, it's actually interesting, I will say, person trips, is it tripping considered to be a form of pshia? Is that a form of like negligence, or a form ultimately of ones? Obviously, it makes a tremendous distinction. Why? Because let's say a person trips, that results in damage. So again, is that damage considered to be an act of negligence, an act of ones, extenuating circumstances? We'll loop back to that as well. Fine. Rabbi Yehuda or miskavin chayiv. So remember again, the Kamma stated that when Reuven has a jug and the jug breaks, the water spills, and therefore, and now Shimon either gets injured through the water or through the shards. That you're chayiv. That's the Kamma. Rabbi Yehuda says, if it's been miskavin, if there was kavana, ultimately Reuven's liable. No kavana, Reuven's not liable. Says the Gemara, what are you talking about? Miskavin. What's the case of kavana here? So says the Gemara, Amar Rabba, miskavin lahorita lamata miksefasal. Rabba says it means that Reuven had kavana to go ahead and take the jug off his shoulder. So if you can imagine the scene, Reuven's holding the jug on his shoulder, and what happens? He goes ahead and he has kavana to put it down. In the process of putting it down, what happens? It breaks. So according to Rabbah, the kavana over here is Reuven has in mind to put it down on Rosh Hashanah. Well, you had in mind to put it down on Rosh Hashanah, and then it breaks, the water spills, right? Shimon is injured either through the water, through the shards. Ultimately, again, there's going to be liability. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi's second to last on the short lines. So what happens? So you go ahead and you have kavana to go and take it down from your shoulder. Now, v'niska means that, let's say he tripped, right? And the jug smashed against the wall. So now, chayiv, you're chayiv for that. You're chayiv for that. The Gemara says, Abaye says, Nechlad nechayiv Rabbi Meir afilu nifshara. So Rabbi says, not necessarily, Abaye says like this, that the truth is, Rabbi Meir, who is more machmer than the Tanakama, he would go ahead and be machmer even if the jug itself disintegrated. Even if the jug disintegrated. Now what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi again. Afilu nifshara, nimucha hakad me'atzma al ksefo dahave ones. So I will say, listen to this. So according to Rabbah, there is an element ultimately again over here of pshia. An element of pshia. What's the element of pshia? You're having in mind to take your utensil off your shoulder, you trip, it gets smashed. The idea over here is you have kavana to take it down off your shoulder. Abai comes along and says, remember this machlok is what Rabbi Meir is saying. Abai comes along and said, no. Rabbi Meir is even more machmer than that. Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maaseh, even if you didn't have kavana to take it down, but just the jug itself disintegrates on your shoulder, that halacha l'maaseh, you would be liable for any resulting damage that would then happen to Shimon as a result of your disintegrated jug in Rosh Hashanah, which I will say obviously is a very high level of liability. So the Gemara says, Amarle, so Amarle Abaye Mechlal, the Mechayir Meir Afilu Nifshra, Amarle in Mechayiv Hayir Meir Afilu Ozna Biyado. So Abaye says yes, Rabbi Meir would hold that if Reuven is holding the jug and the jug just disintegrates to the point that all Reuven is left holding is what? The handle of the jug itself, that Reuven would be chayiv for any subsequent liability that Shimon would encounter. So the Gemara says, Anai, onesu. I would say that's an ones. Can you imagine Reuven's walking with his jug? See, I understand Rabba's point. I understand Rabba's idea that if Reuven's holding his jug and now he has kavanah to put it down, right? And as he's taking it down off his shoulders, whatever, he trips, the jug smashes. When you're in Rosh Hashanah, what's your job? Transport your stuff, get in and get out. Rosh Hashanah is not the place to start putting down your stuff. So you have in mind to put down your stuff and then something happens and someone else gets injured, liability. I get that. But Abaye, Reuven's holding the jug disintegrates. Right? The jug disintegrates. And again, now Shimon gets injured through the water or through a shard, and all Reuven's left is holding literally the handle of the jug. That's an ones. That's an extenuating circumstance. Why should Reuven be chayiv? The Gemara says, "Anasu va'ones rachmana patre." The Torah exempts one in a case of ones. Tichsiv v'lanara lo sa'ased davar. Shabbos says this is referring to the case ultimately again of nara murasa. That ultimately again, if a girl is violated, so if a girl is violated again, and there was absolutely no way for her to call out for help or anything like that, she of course is free from any level of guilt. So Lamais again, Shabbos says that's the paradigmatic example of ones. So I just want to point out, remember, there's different in the world of liability. There's ones and there's shogeg. Shogeg means accidental, but lamaisa, there are still elements of that event that either I could have prevented from occurring, right, or that there is maybe even somewhat of a lack, a certain carelessness, not even a pshia, but a certain carelessness, right, as opposed to ones where there are circumstances there's nothing I could have done to have prevented this. So if Reuven is carrying his utensil, the utensil disintegrates on him, that seems like a real ones case, right? What could Reuven have done to have it all prevented? How could there be liability? So maybe you say, you're right. You know what? A claim of ones works when? A claim of ones ultimately works when halacha l'maisa we're talking about capital punishment. Right? So again, you're not going to put someone to death for ones. But when we're talking about nezikin, damages, so maybe one is liable for damages even in an ones case. V'atanya, we learn nishpara kadav v'lo salko. Right? If Reuven's jug broke and he did not remove the shards, nafal gemalo v'lo ha'emido, or his camel fell down and he did not stand his camel upright. Rabbi Meir mechayiv b'nezikin bezekon. Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa. You are chayiv ultimately again for any damages. The chachamim say ta'apav chavtes pater midine adam v'chayiv b'dinei shamayim. Ultimately, again, you're exempt within a human court, but halacha l'maisa, you are chayiv ultimately in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Umodim chacham Rabbi Meir, the chacham agree with Rabbi Meir. Ba'avno sakino omasao shenichan barosh hagag v'naflu beruach metzuya v'heziko shu chayiv. Yet, I will say, interestingly enough, the chacham agree. So I will say, this is actually an interesting case, right? So Reuven is walking through Rosh Hashanah, and what happens? His jug breaks and he fails to remove the pieces. His camel sits down in Rosh Hashanah, right? And Reuven refuses to go ahead and stand the camel back up, or just walks away. And as a result, people are injured in both of these cases. Rabbi Meir, Reuven, you're liable. Chachamim, you're not liable, at least not in a human court. You may be liable in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but you're not chayiv in a human court. But the Chacham agree with Rabbi Meir in a case of where you left your stone, your knife, your load, and you left them on the top of the roof, and ultimately they were blown off by a ruach mutsuya, common wind, veziko, and they did damage, shu chayiv. In that case, the Chacham will agree that ultimately, again, you are chayiv. You are chayiv. Umodeh, Rabbi Meir the Rabbanon, and Rabbi Meir agrees with the Rabbanon, b'mala kankanin alagag, amnas the nagvon, that if you go ahead and you put jugs on top of a roof to dry out, right? You know, as well say, when you have certain utensils, so normally again you put them in the sun for them to harden and to dry out. So let's say you brought up utensils to your roof to harden and to dry out. V'naflu beruach she'ena matsuya, and then they are blown off the roof through an uncommon wind. So also ruach she'ena matsuya means a much stronger wind. That's what, and then they fall down and they injure someone. Shu pater, that ultimately is pater. So we'll say, what do you see from that? What is that a case of? That's a case of ones. That's a case of ones. Remember, so we'll say, let's pause here for just a moment to reflect on what's happening. So remember again, here's what we have. We have a statement in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maaseh, if you have kavana, Reuven, you have kavana, you're chayiv. You don't have kavana, you're pater. What does Rabbi Meir mean? Rabbi says kavana, that Reuven has the kavana to take the jug off, put it down, and then again it breaks, and then Shimon is injured either through the shards or through the water. Then Rabbi Meir says, kavana, you're chayiv. Abaye says, no. Rabbi Meir even has a heightened level of liability, even if what? Reuven is transporting the jug through Rosh Hashanah, and then what happens? The jug mamish just disintegrates. And now Shimon is injured through the shards or through the water. There's liability. That's ones. And in general, the concept that ones rachmana patra, you're exempt by ones. So maybe you can say, okay, there's an easy answer. What's the easy answer? Rabbi Meir disagrees. Rabbi Meir says, when are you exempt in ones? From capital punishment. But maybe when it comes to financial liability, you are liable when it comes to ones. To which the Gemara will say, just showed in that case that what? No, even Rabbi Meir agrees that when it comes to ones, you're pater. How do you see that? Because what does Rabbi Meir say? Rabbi Meir agrees that in the case where you took your utensils up to the roof to dry out, and then what happens? A ruach she'ena matsuya comes along, blows them off the roof, and let's say blows the utensil right onto Shimon's head, cracks it on his head, and he's injured. Rabbi Meir agrees that what? Reuven is pater. Why? It's an ones. So what do you see from here? Rabbi Meir does hold that ones rachmana pacha, that you are exempt in the case of ones. So what's going on? Ela Amra Abaye says betarti pligi. In reality, they're arguing in two different cases. What are the two cases? B'shas nefila pligi b'shas nefila pligi. Pligi b'shas nefila upligi la'achar nefila. There's actually a two-pronged argument. Right? They're arguing again about damage done at the time that the object falls, and they argue about damage done after the object has fallen already and broken. So as I take a look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says, "El amar Abaye b'tarti pligi b'masnisin kishehizik hakad b'shas nefila upligi kishehuzak becharosim la'achar nefila." So this is actually very interesting. So Abaye really says that there's a two-pronged machlokus Rabbi Meir and the Tana Kamma. Right? Machlokus about damage done when the object is falling, and machlokus about damage done after the object has fallen and now is broken into pieces, and damage occurs with the broken shards. So here we go. So pligi b'shas nefila, ultimately again, so they argue, so we'll say, what does it mean they argue about? They argue at the time when the object falls. What does that mean? Beniskal poshea. We'll say, so this is what I just mentioned before. That's why I was content to run through a little bit until we got back to the two dots, right? The place where I thought we were starting from the beginning, right? Okay, fine. So why? Because this is the machlokes. What's the status of tripping? Right? Is tripping considered to be an act of liability, right? Or is it considered to be b'niskal poshea? Mar savar. So one opinion holds niskal posheahu. So one opinion holds that ultimately, again, that tripping is considered to be pshia. The Gemara says, Umar savar niskal lav posheahu. So we'll say, so machlokas number one, ultimately, again, is, what's the status of tripping? Is tripping considered to be poshea or not? Now, obviously, this is very important. Why? Because, again, if tripping is considered to be an act of pshia, then what? Then any resulting damage that occurs is also what? Pshia. So again, so if halacha l'maisa Reuven trips and his jug breaks, and now Shimon is subsequently injured on the shards, that's called an act of pshia as well. Masha'inkein, if tripping itself is considered to be an ones, a bit of extenuating circumstance, so then l'maisa, or at least even if you don't want to call it ones, if you call it, it's not poshea, then of course there's a much lesser liability, if any at all. So here we go. So that's the first machlokes. So the Gemara says, that's machlokes number one. Then so we'll say that's called machlokes b'shas nefila. So machlokes at the time of falling, i.e., is a machlokes whether or not tripping is considered to be an act of negligence. The Gemara says pligi la'achar nefila. They also go ahead and have another machlokes. What's the other machlokes? After the object has fallen and broken. So what's the machlokes? Here we go. B'mafkir nizakav. So Rabbi say this is very interesting. The next machlokes is what happens, Rabbi say, if you fall, you trip, you fall, the object breaks, and now you have shards, right? Reuven has shards of his object in Rosh Hashanah. And what does he do? He's mafkir it. Right? It's a great way not to have to clean up your own mess, right? Not mine, right? We've got not me, now we've got not mine, right? Not mine. So mafkir nechasa. So I'll say, so what happens if you make the shards, what happens if you make the shards hefker? So the Gemara says, Mar savar, mafkir nezak of chayiv. So one opinion says that halacha l'maisa, if you make your items which have the capacity to damage someone else hefker, ultimately again you're still liable. In other words, making it hefker does not remove your personal liability. Umar savar patar. The other opinion says, no, that actually works. That actually could work. Hefker is hefker. But also take a quick look at Rashi. It's the Rashi on the last wide line, a good Rashi over here. But Mafkir and Zakov, they're all good Rashi. I'm no one to judge. I'm no one to rate Rashis. Right? Everyone is a very helpful Rashi. They're all helpful. So okay, just look at Rashi. But Mafkir and Zakov, Rashi says, Kigon zeh, the mistama mafkir lecharasav. So we'll say, this is actually interesting. Rashi says over here, Lav Dafka, we're talking about a case, right? So there's two things happening over here. Number one, Reuven's tripping, right? So let's just frame the picture in our mind's eye, right? So Reuven's walking to Shrabim. He's got his jug on his shoulder. He trips, he falls, and the jug breaks. So now we'll say there's two things happening over here. Number one, Reuven, you tripped. Halachically, how do we view the act of tripping? Right? Is tripping considered to be a poshea, or is tripping considered to be a shogeg? That's number one. Machlokes. That's number one. Next, now the jug is broken. Reuven decides, you know what? I don't want this. I'm out. Right? I'm out. I just want to go home. Right? So he says, I'm mafkir the shards. So we'll say, now the shaila is, does that work or not? Does that work or not? So now look at Rashi. So Rashi says, Kigon zeh, dimistama mafkir. Now we'll say, now what Rashi adds over here is, Lav dafka that Reuven is saying, hineni muchan muzuman to make the shards of my jug hefker. Rashi says, mistama. Mistama means, the assumption over here is, once that jug breaks, people don't have a use for pottery shards, right? For shards. So therefore, again, mistama, he's just making it hefker. So Rashi says, Rabbi Meir savar mafkir nizakav chayiv. Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, if you make your objects, even though again they have the capacity to damage, you make them hefker, you're still chayiv. It doesn't work. In other words, you cannot divest your ownership interests from a damaging force that you have created. The bar shechayv bebarbish sarabim the hefkerhu chayve. We'll say, and Rabbi Meir's logic is very interesting. Listen to this. He'll say, remember, pottery shards in Rosh Hashanah. What is that? Halachically, what category do we put that into? It's bar. And I will say, we haven't really done a deep dive into bar, but remember, what is the paradigmatic case of bar? Paradigmatic case of bar is, I dig a bar where? Rosh Hashanah. I will say, what's your relationship to that bar in Rosh Hashanah? It's not yours. Why is it not yours? Rosh Hashanah. Yet, interestingly enough, it's not yours, but it is yours. We're going to see, I will say that, and we're actually going to see this in just a little bit, that there are two things that halachically are not yours, but the Torah put it under your ownership. One of them is going to be bar, the second is going to be chametz. So we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Right? So this is actually fascinating. So here, I will say, how can you ever be chayiv for bar b'shtarabim? After all, again, it's a shtarabim, which means no one owns it. So if I go and I dig a bar, I don't own that bar. But the Torah says, for liability purposes, yes, you do. So Rabbi Meir will say, bar is a paradigm. And the paradigm of bar is, if you introduce a damaging force into the public domain, you can't divest yourself of ownership of that. That is yours. That is yours. And even if you make it hefker, it makes absolutely no difference. I will say, think about the tremendous Musar Haskell in this. The tremendous lesson. If you create a damaging force, you cannot walk away from your responsibility. You say, I don't want to be involved in it anymore. If you created it, you own it. If you started it, you own it. You could remedy it, right? You could fix it. Collect the shards, right? Collect the shards. Collect the damaging pieces. I'll say, how often does this happen in life, right? People create damaging realities, and after they've created what they've created, what do they do? What do they want to do? Not mine. Not mine. I don't want to do this anymore. Not mine. I'm just going to walk away. Whoa. You made this. You made this. You created this. You don't get to walk away from something that you created. You made the mess. You own the mess. Now you could clean up the mess. You could fix this. I just want to point out, this is a very remediable, curable, fixable. Right, fixable. Right? This is a very fixable situation. I will say, by the way, what's the fixality of this situation? I just want to get that in. I didn't make up a word this week yet. Right? Wherein lies the fixification of this particular dynamic? I will say, listen to it. It's very simple. What does this require of Reuven? What does it require of Reuven? Right? A broom, a dustpan for the shards, and a mop for the water. Right? That's what it requires. Clean up your mess. You make a mess in life, clean up your mess. Don't put it on someone else. Don't leave it for someone else. Don't blame it on someone else. You made it. Okay, you could whine about it. You could complain about it. You could try to divorce yourself from it. At the end of the day, the best thing to do is just own it and clean it up. But Rabbi Meir says, if you try to walk away from it, it doesn't work. He'll say, so profound. So we spend so much time in life making messes and then pretending like they don't belong to us. Making messes and then trying to put it on someone else, or trying to just walk away or turn the blind eye. It doesn't work. The mess is always yours. And whoever gets injured from that mess that you made, you're liable for that. So much better just to own it and clean it up. Any events, right? Meir says, Even if you try to go, so let's finish Rashi. I told you this was an incredible Rashi. Rashi says as follows. He says, the bar chayv alav Torah bar b'shtarabim, the hefker chayve. Rabbi Meir says again, when you bar b'shus harabim is the paradigmatic case of damage. In other words, so bar does not belong to you. It's in Sharabim, yet the Torah put it in your domain for damage. Rabbi Yehuda savar pater. Rabbi Yehuda says you're pater. Why? The hifkir reshuso v'lo hifkir baro ze bar ha'omer b'Torah ulekaman pli Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Akiva b'hamilsa v'achim Rabbi Yehuda b'miskavin l'shovra v'hizik b'nefila chayiv u'b'she'im miskavin ela miskavin l'horida v'kseifa v'niskal v'nishbara pater. Listen to this. So on the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda, who we're talking about over here, so ultimately Rabbi Yehuda will say that halacha l'maisa, actually, the paradigmatic case of bar, ultimately is where, ultimately again, you made a bar in your rishus. Ultimately again, you are mafkir your domain, but retained ownership over the bar. Again, we're going to see that we haven't seen this yet. We're going to get to this in the Gemara. So therefore, I will say this is the fundamental machlokes over here. So do you have the ability to essentially be mafkir your bar? So Rabbi Meir says absolutely not, because Rabbi Meir says the paradigmatic case of bar is a bar b'shus harabim, where you don't even own the bar. Yet, ultimately, the Torah puts it in your domain for liability. Rabbi Yehuda will say that halacha l'maisa, if you're mafkir the shards, it works. Because Rabbi Yehuda has a different paradigm of bar. His paradigm of bar is actually you dig a bar in your domain, then you're mafkir your domain, your rishus, but retain ownership over the bar. Okay, again, we're not going to delve into that right now. But the point is also the Gemara is making over here is that halacha l'maisa, there's a two-pronged machlokes. Machlokes number one is b'shas nefila, when you're actually, right, at the time when the jug falls down. What's that machlokes? Is tripping, what's the liability for tripping? Is tripping ultimately, again, Poshea or not? Poshea or not? Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda says it's not Poshea. Rabbi Meir says it is. Second machlokes is ultimately, again, after now the kli is broken, sitting on the ground, the shards are there. Halacha l'maisa, can you be mafkir the shards? Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda says yes, you can. The Kamma says no, you can't. Mimai. So the Gemara says, where do you know this from? Mimai. So essentially, the Gemara is asking, how do you know to set this up as a two-pronged machlok? It's really interesting. Mimai midiktani tarti huchlak echad b'mayim o shelaka b'charasas. So the Gemara says it's interesting because remember the Mishnah sets up the case of Reuven's holding the jug falls, breaks, and someone else Shimon gets injured either through what? Either through the water or through the shards. So why do you need both of these? Gemara says, Hainu hach. It's the same thing. They both say, now, it's not totally the same thing as we discussed, but it's the same thing. Someone is getting injured through the broken jug. Why do you have to talk about either? What does it matter if the injury is happening through the water or through the shards? This is what it means to say. Huchlak echad b'mayim b'shas nefila o shelaka b'charasis la'achar nefila. Oh. The Gemara suggests maybe the two parts over here refer to the two elements of damage. When it says somebody tripped in water, what that refers ultimately again is to injury done b'shas nefila. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Ela b'shas nefila heichi ika lemeimar niskal poshehu mau yachal lasos im niskala behemto debishlama. No, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So perhaps again, injury in the water refers to shas nefila, or laka becharosis, injured through the shards, that refers ultimately again to after the shards are lying in the Rosh Hashanah. Umidimas nisan betarti, Brisa nami betarti, and since the Mishnah is going to be set up with these two elements of damage, the Brisa will follow suit as well. So therefore I will say that's the Gemara is suggesting over here. That halacha l'maisa, there's a two-pronged machlokes. Machlokes about the nature of tripping. Is tripping poshea or not? And machlokes as to after now the shards are sitting in Rosh Hashanah, does one have the ability to make a damaging force hefker? That's our shayla. So bishlama kado mishkachas la o b'shas nefila o la'achar nefila. So we'll say I understand the case of the jug. You can set that up ultimately again b'shas nefila or after nefila. Ela gimalo. So we'll say now remember again. Just to understand, we're talking about two things. We're talking about our Mishnah, and we're talking about the Brisa. Remember again the Brisa at the end of Amud Beis, where the Brisa said, your jug broke, ultimately again, and you did not remove the shards. Or your camel fell down and you did not stand up your camel. So the Gemara says as follows. So I understand the case of the jug, you could find two cases, right? There's two cases. You can have either damage done b'shas nefila, which would be ultimately again, is tripping poshea or not, and la'achar nefila. I left the shards in the Rabim, so now again, can I make that hefker or not? Ela gimalo. Also, what about the case of the camel? So I understand the case of the camel. The machlokes ultimately b'shas nefila. Also, what's the machlokes? Right? The camel's sitting there. Camel's sitting there surabim. Right? I don't want to. You know what? I'm too tired. I don't want to get the camel up. So instead, I have a better idea. So I have a better idea. Hefker. All right, I'm making that camel. So that could be the machlokes. Ella, the Gemara says, "B'shal va'achar nefila mishkachasla b'mafkir nevelaso." Right, it could be a case where I say the Gemara is also setting it up where the case where the camel died. Camel died. It's laying there in Shurabim, and I'm mafkir the carcass. So then we go back. We said before, can you be mafkir a damaging force that initially belonged to you? Can you be mafkir? Ella b'shas nefila heichem mishkachasla. But I will say, how do you have? What's the case of the camel where damage is done b'shas nefila, right at the time when it's falling down? Rav Achal kigon da'avra b'maya derech shar asa dinara. Rabbi says interesting case here. What's the case? The case could be where you're leading the animal, literally derech shar asa dinara. What is it? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says shar asa dinara shegadol hanar. We're talking about a case where the river, let's say, overflowed its banks. V'kisa es ein haderech, and it covered up the road. Uposheo. So we'll say, see now what am I doing? I'm leading my camel down a road that is covered with water. Down a road that is covered with water. Now we'll say, now what happens? Uposheo bekach. Now this is an act of negligence. I will say, why is it negligent to lead your animal down a road covered with water? Because obviously if the animal can't see where it's walking, right, that makes it prone to dramatic damage. So what's the case over here? The case over here is where I'm leading my animal tripped and fell down. Now, let's say now it's this damaging force sitting in the Shurabim. Someone else gets damaged as a result. What's the case? So remember, we've now established that there's two elements of damage. There's damage that could be done b'shas nefila, at the time the object, or in this case, animal falls down. And then there's damage that could be done la'achar nefila, after the animal or object has fallen. So I understand the case of la'achar nefila, right? That makes sense, right? In the case of the animal, that could be a case where, let's say, the animal fell, died, and I don't remove the carcass. I leave the carcass there. I try to be mafkir it. So then there's a machlokes. Can you be mafkir a damaging force that you introduce into Rosh Hashanah? But what we're trying to figure out is in the animal case, in the gamal and camel case, what's the case of damage done b'shas nefila, at the time of falling? So the I'll tell you the case. The case is where Ruvain led his animal, ultimately again, over a water-covered road. And then what happens? The animal trips and falls. So we'll say, so that's a case ultimately again of damage done b'shas nefila. So there's negligence there. Ruvain, why are you leading your animal over the case of a water-covered road? The animal obviously can't see where it's walking. If it saw where it was walking, then potentially it could avoid tripping over something. So that's the case, ultimately, again, of poshea, b'shas nefila with an animal. Says the Gemara, hechi dami. Well, let's analyze this for just a bit. What's the case? Hechi dami. So obviously, again, if there was another road that Ruvain could have led his animal on, then of course, Ruvain is a poshea. He's negligent. That was if there was no other road that Ruvain could go down, then what? He's an ones. So what's the case? Rather, I will say, what's the case? The case could be ultimately, again, where Ruvain is interesting. Ruvain tripped, and then his camel tripped over him. Right? That could be the case. Right? So the Gemara says, so therefore we'll say, that could be the case. So just understand what's happening over here. What's happening over here besides a lot of tripping, right? What's happening over here? We're just trying to figure out a case of where you could have a liability case of the camel b'shas nefila. I understand achar nefila, after the animal has fallen down, it's obvious. Let's say the animal died, Reuven leaves the carcass there, is mafkir, that would be the liability case. But more stated, again, what's the case ultimately, again, of b'shas nefila? Could be a case, Reuven tripped, and the animal tripped over him. Rashi says over here, da'askil b'derech yabasha. They were just walking down a regular path. V'niskal be'behemto, v'havele ihu posheya. So I'll say, so remember again, if you go at the idea that tripping is negligent, so then the Maisa, again, when Reuven trips, and then subsequently his animal trips over him, then Reuven will be chayiv ultimately again for that pshia. Okay, so the Gemara says, mafkir nizakov mai miskavinika. So I'll say, so ultimately again, in a case, ultimately, where Allah Maisa, a person, so now I'll say, whether it's the camel case or the jug case. So now, I've introduced the damaging force into Rosh Hashanah. Now I want to go ahead and make it hefker. So ultimately, again, what miskavin, what kavana is there? Rav Yosef b'miskavin liskos b'charasel. So Rav Yosef says, what's the case? So Bosai, ultimately the case could be where he has a kavana to acquire the shards. Look at Rashi. Liskos b'charasel, shalohif kiran chayiv, u'b'she'in miskavin shuv liskos b'an pater, to mafkir nezaka pater. So I'll say, if you remember again, listen to this, and this is where Rashi comes in. This is why Rashi's statement was so profound before. Remember, I'll say, the assumption is that when Reuven is carrying his jug, and then the jug breaks in Rosh Hashanah, what's his relationship to those shards? What's the assumption, the default? Hefker. Right? I'm not. So I'll say, so now what's interesting is as follows. So now the Gemara says like this. There is an opinion that says that if you're mafkir, you're nizakav. If you make your damage, if you make the shards hefker, or I will say without even an actual statement of hefker, just the default ultimately again is that it's hefker, and then someone subsequently gets damaged by that, there wouldn't be liability. However, if I had kavana, if Reuven had kavana to go ahead and reacquire those shards, let's say he did have a use or he just wants the shards, then Einach Inami again, and then they cause damage, there would be liability. Ravashi b'miskavin liskos charasel. And ultimately, against Ravashi says, also we're talking about a case where, the jug breaks, the default is hefker, and then he has in mind to reacquire the shards, and then again, damage occurs, there will be liability. Rabbi Elazar Amar b'shas nafil machlokes. Rabbi Elazar says that in reality, the machlokes Rameir and the Rabbanon is b'shas nafila. But after again the jug has fallen, and let's see how the shards are there. What's talacha? Divrei hakol pater. Everyone agrees that you're pater. Which sounds like that. What the halacha is, or what the idea over here is, the machlokes will be whether or not tripping is pshia. But afterwards, ultimately again, when the jug is broken, laying in the shurabim, everyone agrees that you're pater. Why? It must be hamafkir nizakav pater, that if you make your damaging force that you introduced hefker, that ultimately is hefker. The Gemara says, 1 second, Vaikrai Meir de Mechayiv, but that's not what it says in the Mishnah. Rabbi Meir does say that you're chayiv. Elamai divrei hakol chayiv. Elamai, rather, what do you have to say? Divrei hakol chayiv. That ultimately, again, no, even after nefila, everyone will agree that you're chayiv. V'haikir Rabbanon de Patri, but that's not true. What about the Rabbanon in Mishnah? Right, you will say the Rabbanon, in the Brisa, which was on the bottom of Chav Kasam Beis, right? The Rabbanon on the Brisa that said that if Reuven's carrying a jug, the jug breaks, and you don't remove the shards, the Rabbanon say that you are pater. So not everybody agrees that you're chayiv. So the Gemara says, elamai b'shas nefila. Rather, what does it mean b'shas nefila? Af b'shas nefila. Even at the time that you're tripping, or at the time that it's falling, the kamash malan kida abaye. Ultimately, again, and halacha l'mayis we pass like Abaye. What does Abaye say? Abaye says there's a machlokes at all stages. There's a machlokes at the time of falling, i.e., is niskal, is tripping posheya or not, and there's a machlokes after the object has fallen and quote unquote broken in Rosh Hashanah. And what can you make the damaging force that you introduced hefker or not? So that's why you pass by machlokes on all ends. Machlokes b'shas nefila and machlokes la'achar nefila. On the base, Rabbi Yochanan says the achar nefila machlokes. After the tripping, so to speak. In other words, the damaging object is lying in Rosh Hashanah. Now, that's the machlokes. But at the time, ultimately, again, of tripping or falling, what's the halacha? Divrei HaKol Pater. Everyone will agree that you are Pater. So we'll say, B'Pashtos, what he's saying is, Niskal Lav Posheahu. Tripping is not considered to be negligent. Rabbi Yochanan says later on, Lo Tema Masnisin Rabbi Meir. Do not align our Mishnah with the view of Rabbi Meir. Why? Because Rabbi Meir says, Da'amar Niskal Posheahu. Rabbi Meir holds that tripping is negligent. Michlad Rabbi Meir Mechayiv. So we'll say again, Rabbi Meir then obviously holds that you're Chayiv. Elamai, rather, what do you have to say? Divrei HaKol Chayiv. Everyone will agree that B'shas Nefila, you're Chayiv. I v'hamid tikkun Rabbi Yochanan lekamon lo tema masnisin Rabbi Meir dar niskal poshehu. But again, Rabbi Yochanan says later on, do not align our Mishnah with Rabbi Meir, who says that tripping is negligent. Michlal de pachi rabbanon. That I will say, which sounds like there's a machlokes. So I'll say, so again, you can't. It's hard. What the Gemara is essentially struggling with is, as much as we like to be able to align and to be able to say divrei hakol, everyone agrees X, fill in the blank. You can't say it. So here we go. Rather, again, what you have to say is as follows: the mafkir nizakav dahacha hu de pachi rabbanan da anasu, ava mafkir nizakav da alma machayvi. Oh, so this is very interesting. I will say. So now the Gemara says, I think here's where we're kind of getting caught a little bit in a loop, is that we're trying to group all of the cases together. But in the answer, I will say, there's two different dynamics over here, right? There's a situation where, let's say again, a damaging force was introduced, but as it was introduced ultimately again through extenuating circumstances, versus a damaging force that is introduced through willful action. We'll say, give you a simple distinction, right? A person goes ahead and digs a bar. So I will say, so now a person has done something willful, right? Has done an action, as opposed to Reuven's carrying his jug. The jug, he trips. The jug breaks, and now again I will say, there's a bar. So listen to this. The Rabbana will say as follows. Perhaps one wants to suggest that Allah Chalamaysa, you can make a damaging force hefker, even when it belongs to you, as long as what? The damaging force was introduced as a result of an ones, an extenuating circumstance. In other words, I didn't purposely make it. Something extenuating happened to me and resulted in this bar. So now again, I could divest myself of ownership of it. However, if I intentionally created bar circumstances, you can't walk away from that. Right? You can't make that hefker. So let's ask the Gemara, say, look in Lashon again. The mafkir nizak of the hachal hu de patri rabbanan da anasu. It's in this case. So let's say in this case, Reuven's walking, he trips, the jug breaks. So remember again, the Rabbana hold, niskal lav poshea, tripping is not negligent, right? Tripping, again, it's an accident. It's either a chogeg or it's ones, but it's really not poshea. So now again, yes, there are shards there. But I didn't mean to make this. This was a total accident. So Rabbana say, you know what, in that case, you can make the shards hefker. You can walk away from this. However, but in a general case, where you do something willfully and you introduce a damaging force into this world, you can't make that hefker. Say, for example, in a typical case of where you dig a bar. So again, you decide now, you know what, I don't want this anymore. No. You made this. You cannot go ahead and walk away from this at all. You be chayiv. So it's an interesting distinction, which we'll see. So itmar, mafkin is zakaf. If a person creates a damaging circumstance and wants to make it hefker, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar, chad amar chayiv, chad amar pater. One says chayiv. In other words, you can't divest yourself of ownership of a damaging force after you introduced it. And one says ultimately again you're pater. So lema man de mechayiv ki Rabbi Meir. Let's say the one who says that you're chayiv, he holds like Rabbi Meir. Uman de pater ki Rabbanon. The one who says that you're like the Rabbanon. So the Gemara says no. I'll leave with Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Meir, kuli amalo pligi. Everyone agrees. According to Rabbi Meir, everyone agrees that you're chayiv. Ki pligi. Where's the machlokes? Sorry, that you're pater. Ki pligi. Where's the machlokes? Aliba de Rabbanon. Man de pater ki Rabbanon. Ultimately, again, the one who says that you're pater is like the Rabbanon. Uman de mechayiv, and the one who says that you're chayiv, Amr Lecha will say, Ada da'ami afilu the Rabbanon. Ultimately, again, I hold even like the Rabbanon. Good, 1 second. Alright, I want to do the Rambam, but okay, we'll wait just a little bit. I hold even like the Rabbanon. Good. I hold even like the Rabbanon. Fine. So the Gemara, I feel the Rabbanon. And kanu patri Rabbanon el b'mafkin zakav. The Rabbanon only patred you in a case where, let's say, you make the damaging force ownerless, you make him hefker. So the Gemara says the mafkin zakav the hacha mishum deones danos. Because we'll say again, like this case, even the Rabbanon holds, right? Even the Rabbanon say that Allah Chalamaisa, when you introduce a damaging force, you can make it hefker. That's when the damaging force occurred because of ones circumstances. I didn't purposely introduce it. There was an extenuating circumstance. But ultimately, again, I will say, when you introduce the damaging circumstances, no, you can't just walk away from that. So this time, Rabbi Lazar, this must reflect the view of Rabbi Lazar. The Amar Chayiv. The Amar Rabbi Lazar, Mishur Rabbi Shmuel. So we'll say, here we go. Shnei Devarim Einan B'Rishus An Shal Adam. There are two things that in reality are not in my Rishus, not really under my domain. Va'asana Kosav Kilin B'Rishuso. Yet the Torah makes them as if they are in my Rishus. What are those two things? Be'elohein, bar b'rishus harabim, v'chametz mishesh sha'os u'lamayla. So we'll say, listen to this. So there are two things that, technically speaking, I do not own. Right? A bar b'rishus harabim. I dig a bar in public. We'll say, why don't I own the bar that I dig in rishus harabim? Why not? Rishus harabim. It belongs to everyone. You can't take ownership over that. Yet, what happens? The Torah places it in your rishus, in your domain, for liability purposes. We will say the second example of this is chametz. Technically speaking, once Pesach comes, the Torah says you don't own your chametz. Yet, what happens if you don't divest yourself of your actual chametz ownership? The Torah places it back in your domain for liability purposes. So, two examples of where legally you don't own something, but for liability you own. We'll say an interesting halachic distinction. You do not possess legal title, but you possess liability title. Right? So these are two things. You don't have legal title, but Torah puts it back in your rishus for liability purposes. This time, Rabbi Lazar actually say this. Rabbi Lazar said just the opposite. This time, ha'hofech is actually an interesting case. Hofech as hagalol b'rishus harabim. But say if you overturn dung in rishus harabim, right? Animal waste in rishus harabim, whatever, right? You go ahead. Right? So what happens? V'huzak b'hen achar. I will say now what happens as a result? Someone else is damaged, right? So I want to point out, it's not my dung. It's not my dung, right? So the mice again, Ruvain's animal went ahead and it's like, all right, you could use this a lot in life, by the way, right? Not my dung, right? So Lemaisa, again, it's someone else's, right? It's someone else's. So what happens? So now, Ruvain's animal looks screened in and I just go ahead and I move it somewhere else. So what's that? Now let's say so I come along and move it, and now Shimon is damaged. Right? Shimon slips on it and falls, whatever the situation is, right? So the mice say now, but see what I say? I intervened over here. So I took it and I moved. Literally means overturned, but I moved it. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, I am liable. Rabbi says that's only if you had in mind to acquire it. But if I didn't have in mind to acquire it, then I'm pater. Alma, so what do you see from here? Alma, mafkin is zakav pater. Now we'll say, what do you see from here? What you see from here is that Allah Chalamaisa, Ruvain, whose animal this came from, doesn't have liability. Isn't that interesting? So what do you see from here? They will say, so remember again, when Ruvain's animal excretes in Rishus harabim, so Lamaisa again, that's a damaging force Rishus harabim that Ruvain introduced. And yet Ruvain doesn't have any liability for that. If I come along and decide, I'd like some of that dung, right? I'm going to use it for my field or whatever else. I move it. So now I have liability because I acquired it. But had I not intervened, Ruvain would be pater. So the Gemara says, Amrav Adabar Ava Shechzira Limkoma. Now, what's the case? I will say the case ultimately is where I put it back in its original place. So the Gemara says as follows. So therefore, I will say, in that case, it's as if I never did anything with this dung. To what could this be compared? Lemotse bar megula v'kiso v'chazar v'gilo. Ultimately, what this could be compared to is a person who went ahead and found an open pit, then covered it, and then went ahead and recovered it afterwards. So essentially, there'd be no liability in that case. Why? Because I kind of put things back to where they need to get to. But I'm going to pause here for just a moment because I want to be able just to share with you the Rambam before we run out of time. Because I will say this is actually, so again, the dung case is going to be an illustration of what we said before. But again, I want to close out the week just with this very important halacha, because I will say here we're being introduced to something dramatically amazing, which is what happens when you introduce a damaging force, and then you want to walk away from it. Now we have two different cases. One case is where the damaging force ultimately, again, came about as a result of an ones, and one is it where it came about as a result, ultimately, again, of willful activity. So listen to this. So the Gemara says, this is a Rambam. I should share with you the Choshen Mishpat as well. Here, let me share with you the Shulchan Aruch. Choshen Mishpat Siman Taf Yud Beis. Mishayaton Kad, someone's carrying a jug. V'niskal, he trips. V'nishbar akad, and the jug breaks. V'hizik la'achirim b'shas nefila, and he damages others at the time, right, that it falls down. Pater deniskal lav posheo. So I will say, so number one is that halacha l'maisa, we hold tripping is not negligent. So that's number one. For the Malafichach, im la'achar shenachu shivrei akad ba'aretz, husku b'am adam o shehuchlok b'mayim shenishbechu me'akad, pater midine adam. So I was saying, now watch this. Now this all flows. So I'm sorry. I know we should have really gotten to the Mishnah, but I just couldn't resist. I have to do this halacha with you. So we'll say, so now it also makes the rest of the sugi much easier. So we'll say, so first of all, the Shulchan Aruch Paskins. Tripping is not negligence. Right? Tripping is ones. Therefore, I will say, so number one, if you go ahead and you injure someone tripping, I will say, right? If I trip, so this is actually very important. Let's say a case, I trip, and I injure someone else in the tripping, right? I bump into someone else and they get injured, there's no liability for that. That's not poshea. So the lav poshehu, lefichach, that's case one. Lefichach, im la'achar shenachu shivrei akad ba'aretz, huzik b'hain adam o shehuchlok b'mayim shenishbechu. Therefore, if afterwards, now so I'm walking, and again I'm holding my jug. I trip. So number one, tripping is not negligence. Now the jug falls. Now again I will say there's water and there's shards. Right? So what's the halacha? Now, as a result, Ruvain walks by, and Ruvain either slips in the water or is injured by the shard. Pater midine adam. And pater, there's no liability. Why? The havene mafkir nechasav la'achar nefilas ones v'chaye b'dinei shamayim. So let's say, listen to this. Why? Because what's it? We paskin that halacha l'maisa, once that jug breaks, l'maisa it's hefker. The assumption is it's hefker. And I will say, you are permitted to go and be mafkir, a damaging force that you introduced if it happened ba'ones. That's how we paskin. Incredible. So therefore, I will say, in this case over here, the Shulchan Aruch paskins, no liability. No liability for the tripping, and no liability if Reuven subsequently gets injured on the shards, or ultimately again on the water. So we'll say, so you see from here that when a damaging force is introduced, ultimately again, ba'ones, extenuating circumstances, you are permitted to divest your ownership interest. However, and with this we have to end, however, the chayiv b'dinei shamayim im hayalo penay l'salkam. Now you might be exempt in a human court, but I will say, if you have time to remove the damaging force and you do not do so, you will be chayiv ultimately again b'dinei shamayim. So I will say, so that is the halacha l'maisa. But of course, again, we'll end up by saying hashkafa l'maisa. Hashkafa, we always paskin that if you create the mess, if you create the damaging force, own it, take it, remove it, clean it up. If you create the difficulties, if you create the broken shards, then it is upon you to remedy the broken situation. I will say, shkoyach and good Shabbos. Shabbos, Rabbi Yehuda.